Hi everyone, welcome back to another segment of Answers in Overly Simplified Science. And yeah, that's what I'm going to call it now. We're going to continue this little journey of answers in Genesis and their claims about the heart. And kind of something that I didn't really talk about that much in the last video, which I guess I'll say here, is that this entire article is low-hanging fruit because the entire argument they're making here is, and they're not even making an argument. There's no argument actually being made because all they're doing is they're simplifying science down to like an elementary school level, and they're laying out a fact and then saying this is a fact because God. And they're drawing this conclusion between the fact and God when they're not even laying out any kind of evidence that would say that there should be this connection. But just because my computer exists does not mean God. Like, you can't just say a fact and then say it's God. You have to say something else in between. This is something else. But since that doesn't really matter so much for this entire article, I'm gonna kind of trudge through and we're gonna talk about the actual science and see where they have oversimplified this and kind of what points we can expand upon to make this argument make even less sense for you. So their second challenge here is running in place. And so they're saying that the body has an amazing ability to keep organs stable as we run, jump, and twirl. That might seem easy for kidneys or our bladder, but the heart presents an extra difficulty. It's pumping vigorously all the time. How can it keep moving without sliding around inside the ribcage or something? A solution, a 2-layered sac. I guess I should read the rest of this before I jump in. To protect this non-stop muscle, God placed it in a 2-layered bag called the pericardial sac. The tough outer layer of the sac, called the fibrous pericardium, anchors to the diaphragm, while the inner layer, called the serous pericardium, attaches tightly to the heart. This is true. They're not wrong about that. They laid out a known fact that you have a pericardium. It has multiple layers. And then a special lubricant fluid between the 2 layers allows the heart to slide around with little friction. If it were not for this marvelous lubricated sac, the beating heart would create enough heat to kill us. Okay. So yes, we have a lubricant. We have 2 layers. And yes, there would be a lot of friction if it weren't for this lubricant. But the funny thing is, so they're doing something intentional up here in this first paragraph, where they're saying that might seem easy for our kidneys or our bladder. And why I say this is intentional is because they're trying to compare this to the heart, which has a pericardium, as they mentioned. But other organs in your body do have similar coverings as the pericardium. So your lungs have something called pleura. You have multiple layers of pleura, and you have fluid in between that decreases friction. Your abdomen contains organs such as the liver, the pancreas, the spleen, these other organs are inside something called the peritoneum. And it's a sac that contains your abdominal organs. And it lubricates it, and it holds them steady while you're moving. But the kidney and the bladder are not housed inside the peritoneum, and so that's why they pick these 2 specific organs to single out. It's because the kidney is retroperitoneal, so it is behind the peritoneum, and the bladder is infraperitoneal or subperitoneal, so underneath the peritoneum. So it seems like they're trying to give you some variety to compare to the heart. But no, they picked 2 intentionally outside of the peritoneum organs to comment about. And I do want to comment on the pericardium because so the heart is pumping all the time, yes. But they're saying that as if other organs aren't working all the time and aren't producing heat. So the kidneys aren't pumping necessarily, but they still function all of the time. They're still filtering blood, and they require a lot of oxygen for the electron transport chain, which produces ATP. And when you're producing these, you have to have a proton gradient, and this generates heat. Because our bodies are not efficient, our cells are not efficient. They produce heat, and it's because of this insufficiency that we are warm to the touch. And so your kidneys are going to produce heat. Your fat tissue is going to produce heat. Most of your body is going to produce heat. So yes, we don't want an incredible amount of friction to, like, I don't know, start a fire. But at the same time, you're going to generate heat anyway. And yeah, you have these layers that prevents the friction, but your peritoneum does that as well. Your pleura of your lungs does that as well. And you have, in your brain, you have dura. That doesn't have as much of the friction aspect, but definitely has the protective aspect. And they say here, in this next statement, that the pericardial sac is one more amazing feature that naturalistic evolution has a hard time explaining, but makes sense within a biblical worldview. And I'm really confused by this, because how does evolution have a hard time explaining a connective tissue and fascia and lubrication? This is something that we see across multiple species, across multiple kingdoms. Like, it's not even solely within, like, animals, because, like, plants, you see connective tissue and lubrication. So this is not specific to humans. And so evolution does not have a hard time explaining these things, but I don't get why having a biblical worldview, specifically biblical, not just creationist worldview, but specifically a biblical worldview, that would convince me that a pericardium is the likely outcome. I don't recall any mention of a pericardium in the Bible, or connective tissue or fascia mentioned in the Bible at all. But all right. But not having a pericardium would be a problem. Yes, because your heart will be floating, and you don't want to do that. But also, having a pericardium leads to other problems, because when you're putting a sac around the heart, you're restricting where it can go. You're restricting the extent that it can expand before it contracts. And the thing is, if you were to bleed into your pericardium, this is something called a cardiac tamponade. And so if blood fills very rapidly into the pericardial sac, it's taking up all the space, and your heart can't expand anymore. And so you die very quickly. It's very, very dangerous. And then something else, pericarditis is an infection or some other inflammatory process that affects your pericardium around your heart. And this actually leads to something that we call a friction rub. So if you were to listen to somebody's heart who had pericarditis, you might hear something that sounds like two balloons rubbing against each other, and that is friction. And that's dangerous. So you do prevent friction with the pericardium and lubrication to an extent, but then you also have risk of developing friction. So it's not a perfect system, and they're ignoring that. The next challenge that they have goes into, like, the electrical side of cardiology. And this is kind of a lot to tackle, so I apologize if I seem like I'm ranting a bit on this one. But they say the nerves responsible for our senses tire quickly. Have you ever smelled a strong odor and then stopped noticing the smell? Your nose's nerves simply stopped firing. You literally stopped smelling. The nerves to the heart, in contrast, can never stop firing as long as we live, ever. And this is wrong. And the first thing I'm going to say is that they are comparing sensory function to motor function. So your nervous system is not all one thing. You have certain pathways that are sensory pathways that are ascending pathways, so they're going to your brain. And these pick up information, deliver it to the brain for your brain to deal with. And then there its counterpart, which are usually motor pathways, but we call them the descending pathways. So they go from the brain to wherever they need to go to transmit information. So they're comparing an ascending pathway to a descending pathway. So not even remotely similar pathways. So that's a problem. But then also, the heart can stop firing, and nerves in the heart absolutely do stop firing. And this is something that we call a refractory period. And this is necessary for proper neurologic and cardiac function. So you need, in order to transmit an impulse, you have to have a certain level of stimulation to the nerve. And once you get that level, you're going to get an action potential that fires. And then after that fires, you have a certain period of refractory period where the nerve needs to rest. It needs to reset before it can be stimulated again by another action potential. And this is important because you don't want the heart to be firing rapidly at consistently, because you're going to get really, really fast heart rates. And I'm going to explain why this is a problem. So the heart needs to be able to fill with blood, right? In order to pump blood to your body, it needs to relax and it needs to fill to have any volume at all to push out to the rest of the body. And so you need your nerves to calm down and not fire so rapidly so that it gets time to be able to do that. And also, here's two problems that you're going to get if you didn't have these refractory periods. So the first one, like I mentioned, is that your heart would not fill up to then pump blood. But then the second problem, and I'm going to use an example of atrial fibrillation. So AFib, or atrial fibrillation, is a condition where the atria, it just kind of quivers. It should pump blood to the ventricle, but if it doesn't work super well. It just kind of quivers. And so it's not really pumping anything anywhere. It's just kind of moving stuff around in the local area. And so the blood is just kind of staying in that place because it can't get pushed out. And when it's moving around like that, it is activating clotting factors and the coagulation cascade. So you're getting blood that's starting to congeal in the atrium, but then occasionally, while this atrium is quivering, it might have a decent action potential at some point to cause it to actually pump. And when it does, then you're getting this congealed blood pumping into the ventricle, then pumping out to the body, and usually the next stop, like after it goes, like if you're going through the lungs, then to the left side of the heart, it usually goes out to the brain. So you're getting a stroke or some other type of thromboembolus. And so having a heart rate, and usually this is a heart rate of 150 beats per minute or above, that's what happens when you don't get adequate refractory periods and when you have the heart pumping so rapidly all the time. This is bad. We don't want that. So no, the heart does not continuously pump, the heart continuously pumps, but the nerves don't continuously fire because you need this refractory period to allow the heart to reset to be able to execute these functions. And then something else here. So I won't go into this next bit yet. I'll kind of address this point first. So they say that the heart can never stop firing for as long as you live, ever. But we in modern medicine have learned that we can do something about this. So there's so many cases now where people's hearts literally stop pumping for a period of time. And it might be a short time, it might be a really long time. But they live because we have things like CPR. CPR is amazing. We have lots of fun tools like defibrillation can get your heart start beating again and you stay alive. We have drugs such as adenosine and lidocaine. And then this is my favorite medication for the heart. And this is called amiodarone. And it is essentially the human reset button, if you will. So sometimes somebody might have an arrhythmia that can't really be corrected by any other means, and it's more dangerous to keep their heart in that rhythm than it would be to stop their heart and then reset it. So amiodarone is a drug that will stop their heart momentarily and then start it again and let it work at a regular rhythm. So sometimes I would rather somebody be momentarily without cardiac impulses than have them in an irregular rhythm that we can't fix. So modern medicine is amazing. And sure, if we were just left with a heart that wasn't beating, that would be a problem. But the Bible never gave us an answer for this, but science did. Science gave us CPR, it gave us amiodarone, it gave us defibrillation, so many different ways to make sure that you don't die if your heart stops. And then they're talking about the autonomic nervous system. So yes, I'm going to kind of sum this up for you here, and you can read this. But it talks about God putting in a built-in pacemaker that allows it to run regularly without active outside control. And this is true because the heart does have automaticity. So it can conduct its own nerve impulses. It does not need the brain. It can use the brain, but it doesn't need to. And so they're talking about in the upper right side of the heart, there is a cluster of specialized cells called the sinoatrial node. They generate electrical impulses that stimulate the muscles in the upper chambers to contract. The signal continues moving down to another cluster of cells above the lower chambers, which then fire. These electrical impulses ebb and flow in regular waves without the need for direct input from the brain. If needed, however, the brain can directly control heart rate and blood pressure. The brain constantly monitors the heart to evaluate when to step in. So this is complicated. So you do have multiple nodes in your heart that are responsible for maintaining this pacemaker activity. And each one often compensates when another one fails. So you start off with your sinoatrial node or the SA node. This is typically your pacemaker, but if the SA node stops working, then the AV node will take over as the pacemaker. And then so on down the line, the ventricles can also take over, and that's usually the slowest rate. So the farther along you go in this compensatory pathway, generally the slower the rate is. So each of these nodes has a completely different heart rate that they are set to. So completely different timed pacemakers. And this is a problem when you have ischemia. So if you had a heart attack or anything that caused you to have low oxygen in a part of your heart and that part dies, you get a heart block. And so this is where the electrical conduction cannot pass through that certain area. And so we get an interesting thing here where these pacemakers start competing with each other. So if, let's say, the SA node can't properly signal to the AV node, so you get part of the atrium that might be contracting, and then part of it that's like, okay, I don't know you're here, so I'm going to pump at my own rate. And then maybe if you have a block, typically the block is from the AV node, between the AV node and the ventricles. So if the AV node starts firing, but it can't reach the ventricle thinks that the atrium isn't firing. And so then the ventricle is going to start firing at its own rate, which is different from the atrial rate. And so now you have these two heart rates that are competing with each other. And you get really, really weird rhythms on your EKG when it does this. And it's kind of hard to manage. So, yeah, you have pacemakers. They don't always work right. And this is why a lot of people are given pacemakers. Because, once again, modern medicine is great. And we've figured out how to pace people's hearts. Because a lot of times their hearts don't want to do it for them. Especially when you get older, your heart really stops wanting to cooperate. And this next part, so they start talking about adrenaline. So during a rigorous tennis game, for example, our muscles need more oxygen to burn, so the brain signals the heart directly to increase the heart rate. At the same time, the heart stimulates the adrenal glands to release chemical adrenaline or epinephrine. Adrenaline that keeps the heart rate up without further assistance from the brain. When the tennis match ends and the muscles relax, the brain signals the adrenal glands to stop producing adrenaline and the heart rate returns to normal. Yes and no. They very simplified this pathway because epinephrine signaling is kind of slow. At least like releasing it can be more rapid, but getting to stop is kind of slow because if the brain's telling the adrenal glands to stop producing adrenaline, you still have adrenaline like circulating. You're still gonna get results from it. It's not an instantaneous stop. It takes some time for these processes to slow down. But also, there are multiple receptors that epinephrine acts on. Same thing with norepinephrine. And then you have also dopamine acts on a lot of sympathetic receptors as well. You have other hormones in the mix. You have aldosterone, you have cortisol, you have a whole lot. Also, TSH and thyroid hormones act on a lot of these processes too. And so that's why you can get increased heart rate if you have hyperthyroidism. But all of these hormones kind of work together to get these processes to happen. And you have 4 different receptors that these act on, especially for epi and norepi. You have alpha 1, alpha 2, beta 1, and beta 2. Beta 1 is responsible for your heart rate, and both norepi and epi act on beta 1s. And then you have alpha 1s, which constricts your blood vessels, causing your blood pressure to go up. But then beta 2, it's a little bit counterintuitive because it's not constricting anything or making anything go faster. It's actually dilating your airways, and it also has some vasodilation. So epinephrine can simultaneously vasoconstrict and vasodilate, depending on what part of the body we're talking about. But then there's also alpha 2, and alpha 2 receptors inhibit sympathetic activity. It's more of a regulation. So you have all 4 of those receptors stimulated by epinephrine. So this is just a lot more complicated of a mechanism than they're giving it. It is not just simply brain says heart need to go fast, heart go fast. There's a lot at play here. And again, if you even watch my videos on the adrenal gland and the kidney with aldosterone and cortisol, you can get some interesting things there. Your current blood pressure is going to impact how fast your heart rate can even go due to that kind of regulation. So just plain and simple, this is not that easy. Don't look at this and think that they have a complete process listed here, because this is not it. And then they're using all of this to get to the point of saying that, and this is once again kind of going against their initial point of, despite the marvels of the heart's design, something is terribly wrong. And they're going to talk about how all of the heart problems stem from sin and us not having Jesus and all that jazz. So they start off saying that the body is perfect and that the heart is perfect because if it must be designed because this functions so perfectly. And then they're like, but wait, it doesn't function perfectly. So it must be sin. So they're just going to ignore all of the pathophysiology, everything that we know to be true about how the heart works, its compensatory mechanisms, what we've learned in science to be able to fix these problems, and they're just gonna say, yeah, it's just because you didn't do things right all the time, and now Jesus hates you, or it's like, and then too, like that the little children with congenital heart defects that didn't even make it out of the womb, and they're gonna say it's because of sin, like in their bloodline and stuff that caused this. Like, it's such a scapegoat. And I hope you all can see that the logic just doesn't make sense with them. They're drawing a conclusion where there is none to be drawn. They provided no evidence to say any of this. and they are dumbing down the process so much to the point that it's just incorrect and inaccurately depicting what we see in cardiology and in medicine. So don't be fooled by them. Not at all. Go study cardiology if you want to know more about this, but don't just chalk it up to God, unless if you can tell me reasons why this conclusion can be reached through cardiology. I'd love to hear it. But until you can do that, I'm not convinced. And there's this next little section down here, but I'm going to make a whole other video about this because this is another embryology section here. So anyway, I hope that wasn't too much. I hope I didn't rant a whole lot, even though I know I did. I know I feel like it didn't make sense for a lot of that. But I hope you like it anyway. And I will see you all next time.